In the dying light of a March evening in 1876, somewhere in the unforgiving badlands of Montana Territory, a moment unfolded that would challenge every ugly assumption of its time and prove that humanity could exist even in the hardest hearts and harshest circumstances. A white rancher spoke 5 simple words to a black girl he had just pulled from the jaws of death. Words that should have been ordinary but were instead revolutionary in a time when the color of your skin determined not just your opportunities, but sometimes whether you lived or died. Those 5 words, spoken with gruff certainty in a voice that expected no argument, would be the beginning of a story that defied the prejudices of the era and showed that family could be built from compassion rather than blood, that courage sometimes meant standing against the hatred of an entire community, and that the bonds between 2 people from different worlds could become stronger than steel when forged in the fires of mutual respect and genuine care. The American West after the Civil War was a place of dramatic contradictions, where newly freed slaves sought opportunity and safety in territories that promised freedom, but often delivered continued prejudice and violence. Black settlers moved west hoping to escape the worst of Southern racism, to claim land under the Homestead Act, to build lives in places where their past bondage might matter less than their present determination. But the West was not the paradise they hoped for. Racism followed them across the plains and mountains, sometimes subtle and sometimes brutally open, creating barriers and dangers that made survival even harder than the already harsh frontier conditions. In this complex landscape, where hope and hatred existed side by side, where some communities welcomed black settlers while others drove them away with threats and violence, every act of genuine kindness across racial lines became a small rebellion against the ugliness of the age, a quiet statement that things could be different if people chose to make them so. His name was Jacob Stone, and he had earned his surname through both character and reputation long before it was given to him at birth. Jacob was a man of 52 years who had lived a life harder than most people could imagine, carved from experiences that had worn away everything soft and left behind only the essential core of who he was. He stood tall and weathered like an old tree that had survived countless storms, his face lined with wrinkles that mapped decades of sun and wind and hardship, his hands scarred and calloused from work that never seemed to end. Jacob had built his ranch in the Montana Badlands with nothing but determination and sweat, claiming land that nobody else wanted because it was too rough and too remote, then transforming it through sheer stubborn will into something that could sustain life and even produce modest prosperity. Jacob Stone had fought in the Civil War on the Union side, had seen battles that haunted his dreams decades later, had watched friends die in ways that no person should ever have to witness. The war had changed him in fundamental ways, stripping away the innocent optimism of his youth and replacing it with a grim pragmatism that saw the world clearly without illusions or false hope. But the war had also given Jacob something important, a bone-deep conviction that slavery was evil and that all people deserved to be treated as human beings regardless of the color of their skin. This belief was not based on abstract philosophy or religious teaching, but on concrete experience, on having fought alongside black soldiers who proved their courage and worth in blood, on having seen the horrors of slavery firsthand when his unit liberated plantations in the South. After the war, Jacob had moved west seeking solitude and space to heal from wounds both physical and mental. He wanted nothing to do with politics or social movements or the great questions of the age. He simply wanted to build something with his own hands, to live quietly on his own land, to be left alone to work and survive and exist without the chaos and violence that had defined too many years of his life. He was not particularly friendly or welcoming, did not seek out company or community, preferred his own counsel to that of others. The few neighbors he had learned that Jacob Stone was fair in his dealings but cold in his manner, that he would help if asked but never offered assistance unprompted, that he lived by his own strict code of honor that demanded he keep his word and expect others to keep theirs. Her name was Sarah, though that name had been given to her by people who owned her, and she sometimes wondered if she should choose something different now that she was free, something that belonged to her alone rather than being a remnant of bondage. Sarah was 14 years old, tall for her age and strong from years of hard labor, with eyes that had seen far too much suffering for someone so young. She had been born into slavery in Mississippi, had spent her childhood working in fields under the blazing sun and the overseer's whip, had known hunger and fear, and the constant awareness that her life could be destroyed by the whims of people who considered her property rather than human. The war had brought freedom, but freedom without resources or safety was a fragile thing that could slip away as easily as morning mist. After emancipation, Sarah had tried to make a life in Mississippi with her mother and younger brother, but the world they found themselves in was only marginally better than slavery itself. Sharecropping kept them in perpetual debt. Violence from white supremacist groups made every day dangerous, and opportunities for education or advancement were systematically denied. When Sarah's mother died from pneumonia that went untreated because no doctor would see a black woman without money, Sarah and her brother Marcus had decided to head west, following stories of black communities in Kansas and other territories where former slaves had created towns and farms of their own, places where they might actually have a chance to build real lives. The journey west had been harder than anything Sarah could have imagined. She and Marcus traveled with a group of other black families seeking better circumstances, pooling their meager resources for supplies and safety in numbers. But resources ran low, animals died, illness struck the group, and people began to turn back or scatter in different directions seeking help. Then came the night when their camp was attacked by bandits who cared nothing about the desperate circumstances of the travelers they robbed. In the chaos and violence, Sarah and Marcus were separated. She ran into the darkness with gunshots echoing behind her, ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, ran until she could no longer hear the sounds of the attack, and then she found herself alone in wilderness. She did not know, with no supplies and no idea where her brother had gone. For 3 days Sarah wandered through the Montana Badlands, drinking from streams when she found them, eating nothing because she had no food and no knowledge of what wild plants might be safe. She walked during daylight and tried to sleep hidden among rocks at night, jumping at every sound, terrified of wild animals and hostile strangers and the emptiness that surrounded her on all sides. The Badlands lived up to their name, a landscape of broken stone and scattered brush that offered little shelter and less comfort, beautiful in a harsh way, but utterly indifferent to whether any particular human lived or died within its boundaries. On the third day, weak from hunger and thirst and exhaustion, Sarah collapsed near a dry creek bed and lay there watching the sky darken, wondering if this was where her story would end. Jacob Stone found Sarah purely by chance, riding back to his ranch after checking on cattle in his northern pastures. He almost missed seeing her entirely, because she was curled up behind a rock in a way that made her blend into the landscape. But his horse suddenly shied and snorted, drawing Jacob's attention to something that should not be there. And when he dismounted to investigate, he found a young black girl barely conscious and clearly in desperate condition. Jacob's first instinct was to assess the situation with the practical efficiency he applied to all problems. The girl was alive but dangerously dehydrated and weak. She had no supplies or weapons, and if left here, she would certainly die before morning. Jacob knelt beside Sarah and spoke to her in a voice he tried to make gentle despite decades of disuse. "Can you hear me, girl? Can you stand?" Sarah's eyes opened, unfocused and confused, seeing a white man leaning over her and immediately feeling a spike of fear that cut through her exhaustion. Her experience had taught her that white strangers often meant danger, that she should be careful and guarded. But she was too weak to run and too desperate to refuse help, even if it came from a source she had learned not to trust. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, and only a cracked whisper emerged. Jacob moved quickly, pulling a canteen from his saddle and helping Sarah drink slowly, knowing that giving water too fast to someone severely dehydrated could cause more harm than good. He watched as the girl drank, noting her ragged clothing and the evidence of hard travel, the fear that flickered in her eyes even as she accepted his help. When she had drunk enough, Jacob asked the questions he needed answered. Was she alone? What had happened to her? Were there others who might need help? Sarah managed to explain in broken sentences about the attack on their camp, about her brother Marcus, and how they had been separated, about running into the wilderness and getting lost. Jacob listened without interrupting, his face showing no particular emotion as Sarah told her story. When she finished, he stood and looked around at the darkening sky and the empty landscape stretching in all directions. He made a decision based on practical assessment rather than sentiment. This girl would die if left out here, and he had the means to prevent that death, so preventing it was what he would do. It was that simple in Jacob's mind, a matter of basic human decency that required no special virtue or congratulation, just the minimum moral response that any decent person should make when confronted with another human in desperate need. "You'll stay with me tonight," Jacob said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who expected no argument and would tolerate no foolishness. "My ranch is about 3 miles south. I'll get you there, get you fed and rested, and tomorrow we'll figure out what to do about finding your brother and getting you to wherever you were headed." He extended his hand to help Sarah stand, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it and allowed him to pull her to her feet. Sarah swayed unsteadily, her legs barely able to support her weight after 3 days of starvation and dehydration. Without a word, Jacob lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness for such a rough-looking man, then mounted behind her and turned the animal toward home. They rode in silence through the gathering darkness, Sarah clinging to the saddle horn and trying to process what was happening. This white rancher was taking her to his home, was offering her food and shelter without asking for anything in return, and every lesson her life had taught her suggested she should be wary and afraid. But exhaustion and desperation left her no choice except to trust, and something in Jacob's gruff but steady presence suggested that maybe, just maybe, this was one of those rare situations where trust would not be betrayed. When they reached Jacob's ranch, Sarah was barely conscious again, drifting in and out of awareness as hunger and exhaustion finally caught up with her completely. Jacob carried her into his house, a solid structure built from logs and stone that spoke of years of careful work, and laid her on a bed in a small room he used for storage. He brought her water and broth, insisting she drink slowly, then left her to rest while he tended to his horse and thought about what he had gotten himself into by bringing this girl home. Jacob understood perfectly well that what he was doing would be controversial in the eyes of many of his neighbors. A white man bringing a young black girl to his ranch and allowing her to stay in his home would spark gossip at minimum and potentially real trouble if the wrong people decided to make an issue of it. Montana Territory had fewer of the most virulent racists than the South, but prejudice existed here too, and there were plenty of people who would see something sinister or improper in Jacob's simple act of mercy. But Jacob Stone had not survived 52 hard years by worrying over much about what other people thought, and he had not fought in a war to end slavery only to turn away a girl who needed help, because helping her might cause him social difficulties. Sarah woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through a small window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifting through the house. For several confused seconds, she did not know where she was or how she had gotten there, and then memory returned in a rush. The attack, the day's wandering lost, the rancher who had found her and brought her to his home. She sat up slowly, her body aching from exhaustion but no longer trembling with the weakness of starvation. Someone had covered her with a thick blanket while she slept, and a basin of clean water sat on a small table beside the bed where she could wash her face. When Sarah emerged from the room, She found Jacob cooking breakfast at a cast-iron stove, moving with the efficient economy of a man long accustomed to taking care of himself. He glanced at her when she appeared but did not stop his work. "Sit down at the table," he said without preamble. "Food will be ready in a minute. There's coffee in the pot if you want it, or water if you prefer." Sarah sat, still uncertain and wary, watching this strange white man who had saved her life and trying to understand what he expected from her in return. Jacob served breakfast and sat across from her, eating his own food without much conversation beyond basic questions about how she felt and whether she could keep the food down. When they had finished, he pushed back from the table and looked at Sarah directly. "Here's the situation as I see it," Jacob said in his gravelly voice. "You need to find your brother and get to wherever you were heading. I'm willing to help with that, but it's going to take some time. I'll ask around at the trading post and talk to people who might have heard about a group that was attacked or a boy traveling alone. Meanwhile, you'll stay here where you're safe and fed. You can help with chores around the ranch to earn your keep if you're strong enough, or you can rest until you've recovered your strength. Either way, you'll stay until we figure out your next move." Sarah stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. This rancher was offering to let her stay, was going to help her find Marcus, was treating her like a person whose welfare mattered. It went against everything her experience had taught her to expect from white strangers. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly, the question emerging before she could stop herself. Jacob was silent for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful as he considered how to answer. "Because you needed help and I could provide it," Jacob said finally. "That's reason enough in my book. I don't hold with letting people die when I can prevent it, and I don't much care what color they are when I'm making that calculation. You're a human being in need of assistance, and I'm a man with the means to assist. Everything else is just details." He stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes, clearly considering the conversation finished. Sarah sat at the table feeling tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple decency of this gruff rancher who helped because it was the right thing to do rather than because he expected anything in return. The first few days were awkward for both of them as they learned to exist in the same space and developed a rhythm of coexistence. Jacob was not accustomed to having anyone else in his home, had lived alone for so many years that another person's presence felt intrusive and strange, no matter how quiet and unobtrusive Sarah tried to be. For her part, Sarah remained wary and watchful, unable to fully relax despite Jacob's consistent kindness, waiting for the moment when he would reveal whatever ulterior motive she assumed must exist beneath his helpful exterior. But days passed, and Jacob did nothing except what he had promised. He provided food and shelter, he asked around about her brother, and he treated her with a gruff respect that made no distinction based on the color of her skin. Gradually, Sarah began to help with ranch work, partly because she wanted to earn her keep, and partly because idleness felt wrong after a lifetime of constant labor. She helped with cooking and cleaning, carried water from the well, fed chickens and collected eggs, and slowly took on more tasks as her strength returned, and Jacob trusted her with increasing responsibility. Jacob taught her things as they worked together, explaining about the animals and the land in his usual matter-of-fact way, neither praising her when she did well nor criticizing harshly when she made mistakes, but simply correcting and moving on to the next task. In the evenings they would sit on Jacob's porch as the sun set over the Badlands, and slowly, gradually, they began to talk beyond the bare necessities of daily communication. Sarah told Jacob about her life in slavery, about her mother and her brother, about the dreams that had brought them west and the violence that had shattered those dreams. Jacob listened without judgment or pity, asking occasional questions but mostly just letting her speak. And Sarah found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, because this stern rancher seemed to understand suffering without needing explanations or reassurances. Jacob, in turn, spoke about the war and the things he had seen, about the black soldiers he had fought alongside, and how they had changed his understanding of what courage and humanity looked like. He talked about why he had come west and what he had built in this harsh land. And gradually, Sarah began to see him not as the frightening white stranger who had found her dying, but as a complex human being carrying his own scars and doing his best to live according to principles that mattered to him. Trust grew between them slowly, built from these evening conversations and the daily proof that Jacob's actions matched his words, that his help came with no strings attached and no expectations beyond basic mutual respect. Word eventually spread to the nearest town that Jacob Stone had a young black girl living at his ranch, and the reaction was mixed in ways that reflected the complicated racial attitudes of frontier Montana. Some people shrugged and figured it was Jacob's business what he did on his own property, and if he wanted to help a girl who had been in trouble, that was decent of him even if it was a bit unusual. Others whispered and speculated, suggesting that there must be something improper about the arrangement, that a white man and a black girl living under the same roof without a chaperone or family connection was inappropriate regardless of the circumstances that had created the situation. And a few, including a rancher named Bill Crenshaw, who had never liked Jacob and who brought virulent racist attitudes with him from Texas, decided that something needed to be done about this affront to proper social order. Crenshaw and two other men rode out to Jacob's ranch one afternoon about 3 weeks after Sarah had arrived. They found Jacob and Sarah working together to repair a fence, and Crenshaw announced loudly that he was there to discuss the situation that was causing concern in the community. Jacob straightened up slowly, his face showing no emotion but his body language making clear that he was not pleased by this intrusion. He told Sarah to go back to the house, and though she wanted to stay and hear what would be said, she obeyed because she could see the tension in Jacob's shoulders and did not want to make the situation worse. Crenshaw wasted no time getting to his point. "It ain't proper, Stone, you having that colored girl living here with you," he said, his voice carrying a tone of self-righteous certainty. "People are talking, and they're concerned about what might be going on under your roof. Now, I'm sure you mean well, but the girl needs to be somewhere more appropriate. There's families in town who would take her in, put her to work as hired help where she belongs." The implication in his words was clear. Black people belonged in positions of service and subordination, and Jacob's treatment of Sarah as something more like a guest or family member violated the racial hierarchy that Crenshaw believed should be maintained. Jacob looked at Crenshaw and the other two men with an expression of cold contempt that made them shift uncomfortably in their saddles. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carrying a hard edge that warned of danger beneath the surface. "What happens on my property is my business and nobody else's. Sarah is staying here until we find her brother and figure out where she's going next. She's under my protection, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Now get off my land before I decide you're trespassing." Crenshaw's face flushed red with anger. "You can't just ignore the concerns of the community, Stone. There are standards that need to be maintained, proprieties that matter. You're putting yourself outside civilized society by harboring that girl." Jacob's hand moved to rest casually on the gun he wore at his hip, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. "I fought a war over whether people like Sarah should be considered property or human beings," Jacob said coldly. "The answer was human beings in case you missed the outcome. Now I won't ask again. Get off my land." The confrontation with Crenshaw marked a turning point in Sarah's stay at Jacob's ranch. After the men had ridden away, Jacob came back to the house to find Sarah standing by the window, having watched the entire encounter from inside. She looked at him with eyes full of worry and guilt. "I'm causing you trouble," she said quietly. "Maybe I should leave, go find my own way. I don't want people to make problems for you because you helped me." Jacob looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head firmly. "You're not causing me trouble," Jacob said. "Ignorant people with ugly ideas are causing trouble, and that's not your responsibility. You'll stay here as long as you need to, and anyone who doesn't like it can go to hell for all I care." I didn't fight to end slavery just to let people like Crenshaw maintain it in spirit if not in law. His words were gruff and matter-of-fact, but Sarah heard the steel underneath them, the absolute certainty that he would not be moved or intimidated. For the first time in her life, she felt what it was like to have someone stand up for her not because they had to, but because they believed it was right. The weeks that followed brought more visitors, though not all of them hostile. A few townspeople came to express support for what Jacob was doing, including a minister named Reverend Walsh, who praised Jacob for his Christian charity. Jacob accepted these words with the same indifference he had shown to Crenshaw's hostility, making clear that he did not need anyone's approval and was not seeking praise for doing what any decent person should do. But Sarah appreciated these visits because they showed her that not everyone in the territory was hostile to black people, that there were at least some white folks who believed in treating others with basic human dignity regardless of race. Meanwhile, Jacob continued asking around about Sarah's brother Marcus, sending word through traders and travelers, checking with anyone who might have information about a young black boy traveling alone or groups that had been attacked. For weeks there was no news, and Sarah began to fear that Marcus had not survived the attack or had gotten lost and died in the wilderness as she nearly had. But then one day Jacob came back from town with information. A family heading to Kansas had taken in a boy matching Marcus's description, and they were currently camped about 40 miles south waiting for wagon repairs before continuing their journey. Jacob and Sarah rode south together to investigate the report, and when they reached the camp, Sarah's heart nearly burst when she saw her brother alive and well, helping to repair a wagon wheel alongside the family that had taken him in. Marcus looked up at the sound of approaching horses, and when he recognized his sister, he dropped his tools and ran toward her with tears streaming down his face. Sarah slid from her horse and caught him in a hug that lasted for long minutes, both of them crying and laughing, and trying to talk at the same time, relief and joy overwhelming them both after weeks of terrible uncertainty. The family that had rescued Marcus were named the Johnsons, and they explained how they had found him wandering alone several days after the attack, how they had taken him in and cared for him, and how they were heading to Kansas where they had family and land waiting. They invited Sarah to join them, offering to take both siblings to Kansas where there were established black communities and opportunities that Montana Territory might not provide. It was a generous offer and a logical one, and Sarah knew she should accept it immediately. This was what she and Marcus had been trying to reach when everything went wrong, this chance to build a life in a place where they might have real opportunities. But as Sarah stood there holding her brother and listening to the Johnsons describe their plans, she found herself unexpectedly conflicted. She looked at Jacob Stone standing quietly beside his horse, waiting patiently for her to make her decision, and she realized that somewhere over the past weeks she had begun to think of his ranch as something like home, had begun to see this gruff rancher as something like family. He had shown her a kindness and respect she had rarely experienced, had treated her as a person of worth and dignity, had stood up against his own community to protect her. The thought of leaving felt like abandoning someone who had become important to her. Jacob saw the conflict in Sarah's face and spoke before she could ask the question he could see forming. "You should go with your brother," he said quietly. "He needs you, and Kansas is probably a better place for both of you than staying here. The Johnsons seem like good people, and they'll help you get started right." His words were sensible and practical, but Sarah heard something beneath them that might have been regret, and she understood that Jacob had also come to value their unlikely friendship, even if he would never say so directly. Sarah looked at her brother, then at Jacob, then back at Marcus again. She knelt down so she could look Marcus in the eyes and spoke seriously. "Marcus, I need to tell you about what happened to me after we got separated, and then we need to make a decision together." She explained about Jacob finding her, about the weeks at his ranch, about how he had helped her and protected her and treated her with a respect she had not known white people were capable of showing. Marcus listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Jacob, clearly trying to assess this white rancher who had become so important to his sister. When Sarah finished her explanation, she asked Marcus what he wanted to do. Did he want her to come with him to Kansas, or would he be willing to stay in Montana at least for a while longer? Marcus thought for a long moment, then asked if he could speak with Jacob privately. The two of them walked a short distance away, and Sarah watched anxiously as her brother and the rancher talked, unable to hear their words but seeing the serious expressions on both faces. After several minutes they returned and Marcus spoke first. "Sarah, Mr. Stone just offered to take both of us in," Marcus said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and hope. "He says his ranch is big enough for 3 people, and he could use help with the work. He says we can stay as long as we want, learn the ranching business, and if we decide later we want to go to Kansas or somewhere else, he'll help us get there with enough money to start proper. He says it's our choice, but the offer is genuine if we want it." Sarah looked at Jacob, who nodded confirmation, his weathered face showing no particular emotion but his eyes carrying a quiet sincerity that she had learned to recognize. Sarah and Marcus stepped away to discuss the offer privately. It was an extraordinary opportunity, but also a risk. Staying with Jacob meant remaining in a place where at least some people had shown hostility to their presence, where they would always be outsiders in some sense because of their race. But it also meant staying with someone who had proven himself trustworthy, learning skills that could serve them anywhere, and building on the foundation that had already been established. After long discussion, the siblings reached a decision. They would stay with Jacob Stone, at least for now, and see where that path led them. The first months of Marcus and Sarah living together at Jacob's ranch were not easy for anyone involved. 3 people from vastly different backgrounds learning to coexist required patience and adjustment from all parties. Jacob had to get used to having not just 1 but 2 young people in his home, had to learn how to be something like a parent or guardian, even though he had never had children of his own. Sarah and Marcus had to adapt to Jacob's gruff manner and high expectations, had to learn that his criticism was meant to teach rather than demean, had to trust that his protection would hold even when faced with hostility from some of their neighbors. But gradually, through shared work and shared challenges, they became something that looked increasingly like a family, even though they would never fit anyone's traditional definition of what family should look like. Jacob taught both siblings everything he knew about ranching, treating them not as servants or hired help, but as apprentices he was training to become competent and independent. Sarah proved to have a particular talent with horses, developing a gentle touch that calmed even the most nervous animals. Marcus excelled at the practical work of building and repair, showing a mechanical aptitude that Jacob recognized and encouraged. They developed routines and traditions, small rituals that bound them together and created a sense of belonging. Sunday dinners where they would rest from work and Sarah would cook special meals. Evening conversations on the porch where they would talk about their days and their plans and their dreams. Working side by side during the busy seasons, when the ranch demanded every available hand and cooperation, became the only way to get everything done. These shared experiences slowly erased the boundaries of race and circumstance that society said should keep them separate, replacing artificial divisions with genuine bonds built on mutual respect and proven loyalty. The community's reaction to this unusual household remained mixed, but over time, most people came to accept Jacob's arrangement even if they did not fully understand or approve of it. Jacob Stone was known as a man of absolute integrity who kept his word and expected the same from others, and his reputation carried weight that protected Sarah and Marcus from the worst of potential hostility. The few who continued to object learned that challenging Jacob on this matter was pointless and potentially dangerous, that he would not be moved by social pressure or threats, that he had drawn a line and would defend it with whatever force became necessary. Years passed, and Sarah and Marcus grew from frightened teenagers into capable adults under Jacob's guidance and protection. Sarah became one of the finest horse trainers in the territory, respected by even the most prejudiced ranchers because her skill was undeniable, and horses did not care about the color of the person handling them. Marcus developed into an expert builder and mechanic, able to construct or repair almost anything, his services sought throughout the region. Both siblings eventually established their own homesteads on land adjacent to Jacob's ranch, building houses and starting families of their own, while maintaining their close connection to the man who had saved Sarah's life, and given them both a chance at a future they could never have imagined. Jacob Stone lived to be 73 years old, surrounded in his final years by the extended family that had grown from his decision to help a dying girl he found in the Badlands. Sarah and Marcus cared for him as he aged, repaying his kindness with devotion, and ensuring that his last years were filled with the warmth of human connection he had lived without for so long before finding them. When Jacob died peacefully in his sleep, Sarah and Marcus buried him on a hill overlooking his ranch, marking his grave with a stone that bore simple words. He helped because it was right. The story of Jacob Stone and the two black children he saved and raised spread through the territory and beyond, becoming one of those tales that people told when they wanted to remember that even in dark times, even in places where prejudice seemed to rule, there were individuals who chose to be better, who acted according to conscience rather than social expectation, who built families and futures from courage and compassion rather than from blood and tradition. The 5 words Jacob spoke that first night, "You'll stay with me tonight," became a symbol of the choice everyone faces when confronted with another person's need. We can turn away and protect ourselves from inconvenience, or we can offer help even when doing so brings us trouble and requires us to stand against the prejudices of our time. The story of Jacob Stone finding Sarah in the Badlands and speaking those 5 simple words that changed both their lives is ultimately a story about what family really means and what courage actually requires. Jacob could have ridden past that dying girl, could have told himself it was not his problem, could have chosen the easy path that would have kept his life simple and uncomplicated. Instead, he chose to help, and then he chose to keep helping even when doing so brought him criticism and hostility, even when his neighbors questioned his judgment and his motives, even when taking a stand for basic human decency meant standing alone against the prejudices of his community. Sarah and Marcus could have been destroyed by the violence and loss they experienced, could have learned from their hardships to trust no one and expect the worst from every situation. Instead, they chose to accept help when it was offered genuinely, to work hard and prove themselves worthy of the chance they were given, to build something meaningful from the opportunity that Jacob's courage had created. Together, these 3 people from different worlds and different experiences created a family that defied every social convention of their time, proving that the bonds between human beings can transcend the artificial boundaries of race when people choose to see each other as individuals rather than as categories. The Wild West was a place of harsh realities and brutal prejudices, where survival often seemed to require hardness and where kindness could be mistaken for weakness. But the story of Jacob, Sarah, and Marcus reminds us that even in the hardest places and the darkest times, there are people who choose compassion over cruelty, who stand up for what is right even when doing so costs them dearly, who build families from courage and love rather than from blood and tradition. 5 words spoken on a March evening in 1876. "You'll stay with me tonight," became the foundation of a family that should not have existed according to the rules of its time, but that flourished anyway because the people involved chose to make it so. Their story echoes across the decades as a reminder that family is built from care and commitment, that courage sometimes means defying your community to protect someone society has decided does not matter, and that the simple act of offering shelter to someone in desperate need can change the world in ways that ripple far beyond that single moment of choice.